Hello and welcome to episode 8 of What Moves Us. I'm here at the House of St Barnabas where we first started, sitting with Johannah. Say hello.
Hello.
And we have a special guest today who is
Max from DLMDD. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. We're in the chapel, so hopefully you approve of the acoustics. Could you tell us who you are? What's your name and where'd you come from? But we already know your name.
Yeah, I'll give you my full name. My name's Max De Lucia. I'm the client director, one of the founding partners at a sound agency called DLMDD.
What does DLMDD stand for?
Well, it's the good question. This is the second time I've been asked that today already, actually. The first was by someone in Hong Kong. So there's a bit of old school advertising in there. We work with brands on how they sound. That's what we do day to day. And in ad land, typically you see a lot of agencies with names that are the initials of the founding partners. And so DLMDD, the DL is the two initials in my name, which are De Lucia. The M is my business partner Greg Moore, and the DD is one of our other founding partners, Sasha Darroch Davies. And there's a bit of a gag behind the name, which I can't remember if I would have told you before then.
I don't remember this.
Or not, but one of the founding partners, Sasha, who I mentioned last, his kids were learning, you know, the knuckle song on the piano that kids learn when they're growing up, and they like roll their knuckles up the black keys of the piano, and it goes da 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 da. And he said one day, when we were starting the agency, he said, "Guys, maybe I'm going mad here, but I was in." I should have rolled my knuckle. People can't see what I'm doing, can they? But he said,
I should have filmed that.
Yeah, maybe we could do that afterwards. He said, "Guys, the kids are learning this thing on the piano, and I can kind of hear our initials in this little audio signature." And of course, a lot of the work we do with brands is commonly around how they sound and audio signatures and all that sort of stuff. So there's a little bit of what we call a mnemonic, an audio signature behind our name as well, which is basically just a bit of a funny gag. And that's the real story. The other side is most people see it as this kind of like initials of an advertising firm, but it's actually just a bit of fun.
I've never heard of knuckles before. Is that similar to chopsticks?
Yeah, similar. It's kind of thing.
So you can tell I'm old because it was chopsticks.
Yeah, chopsticks, knuckle songs. Yeah, chopsticks sometimes is the easier way of putting that across, but. There you go. Maybe we could drop that one in afterwards. But yeah, there's a bit of fun behind it.
Cool. So we have had a conversation before about considering how brands use sonic signatures.
Anything to do with sound, yeah.
So, and opportunities elsewhere in industry and life to help doing this. So you have worked with a transport company already.
Yeah.
Actually, just before we go on that, just to rewind, because when you said about meeting with Max and having that conversation, my first thing was, what's a sonic sound? I'd never heard of it before.
Sure.
It's a diddle and dun dun.
Yeah, exactly.
I know, but many of our listeners might be like me, but as soon as you explain it and you mention some of the brands, you actually think, oh yes, that's one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very traditional, iconic examples in our world that typically are referenced time and time again. Probably if we start with, maybe because it's relevant, British Airways and their use over time of the Lac Mayflower duet is referenced very, very heavily in our world of kind of sonic branding. So whenever you walk on board a British Airways aircraft, that theme from the Lac Mayflower duet filters across the aircraft and into their communications, etc.
Does it?
Yeah, it does, yeah, absolutely.
I've never noticed.
By the composer Leo Delibes, they really sort of over time...
Yeah, because it won loads of awards at the time, didn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. They've really iconically... They used a piece of music that was already out there in the world, if you like, and sort of coined that and have used it so consistently over time that it's very heavily attributed to them. Similarly, in more sort of audio signature terms, you've got things like McDonald's and I'm Loving It is referenced time and time again. Intel, that's the one.
It was the Intel one that
Intel.
Went, as soon as I saw that was the first one that came up in the search engine.
These are like sonic branding classics that are referenced, in literature and books. If you see articles, typically these are the kind of things that we reference. Interestingly, the Intel bomb, I've seen some statistics somewhere that apparently it's the world's most ever played piece of music. And it was written by a guy called Walter Wowoza.
Is he making lots of money?
I don't know, it'd be interesting to ask him, wouldn't it?
Royalties with every advert.
Yeah, absolutely. But obviously that's another iconic example as well.
Okay, you can carry on now.
Yeah.
Now that we've explained what it is.
Now that we know what they are, we can recognise them, and we need one. you mentioned that you work in transport companies, so am I allowed to name the companies?
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So
Far away, yeah.
you previously played for me the Norwegian Airlines thing, and could you tell us just a bit about how? So, I guess for Johannah's benefit, because you haven't had this conversation, is Norwegian commissioned you to make a sonic signature, and now that there is this harmony across all of their brands, whether it's the airline or.
And I think for Norwegian, there is a video on YouTube, isn't
Yeah,
there?
absolutely.
About how you did that.
Yeah, there is. That's correct.
We'll put a link in the description.
Yeah.
But how, if someone says to you, I want to come and do a sonic signature, the question is why they do it, if they're not sort of a main commercial brand, and also how you do it, and how do you know if it's been successful?
Good questions. You might have to remind me of them.
That's a lot of questions.
That's 3.
I'll write them down.
So the first question was why, I think. Why do you do it in the first place? And typically conversations in the world of sound are very new for most brand leaders and marketeers. These are things that most people haven't embarked upon before. If we take the rail space even as an example, there are very iconic visual brands that we all recognise very, very quickly. There are less well-known examples of how they sound and how we would recognise those brands for how they sound. And that's a very good starting point, because in industries that are very unsaturated with sound, obviously there's an opportunity for marketers to drive standout and preference and recall. Exactly, recall, recognition, all those kinds of things that people want as marketers. They want brand equity, they want to stand out in the marketplace. That's often quite a good starting place, and that's normally what the brief looks like. We know what we look like as a brand. What do we sound like as a brand? Is typically where these things start. Where I think agencies such as ourselves come into play is to look at the broader applications of sound beyond just an audio signature or a piece of music that becomes associated with that brand. And some of the things we were talking about in the past have included, how music can change behaviour, how it can affect the ways our sort of behavioural actions, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And that's quite interesting as well. So I think there's not just the kind of very classic examples of perhaps where sonic branding has been, which is basically an audio logo, if you like, but actually what we're interested in as an agency is actually the broader applications of music and sound and how we can solve brand challenges and business challenges with music and sound as the creative solution to that as well. Your second question.
How do you go about developing one?
Another very, very good question. So obviously, whenever a client embarks upon a music and sound project, often they want to dive straight into the making of the music straight away. They want to get in the studio, they want to be working with writers, but that's the fun stuff. But before we do any of that, we embark upon quite a hefty and deep development process that looks at what is the challenge here, what is the brand, what do they stand for, what are the values behind them, and actually how can we derive music and create a sonic architecture and a sonic identity that actually is born from the DNA of that business itself. And that's a lengthy process of looking at actually what that business stands for, who it's communicating with, what its history is, what its ambitions are for the future. We go through a process of putting in place a brand architecture, I suppose, of as we all know, music is such a subjective thing. Yeah. What I like, you might not like, and that's something that we come up against time and time again. So,
but then you remember things you don't like.
That is very true. That is very, very true. But when we're evaluating work as a group of people, because obviously these are business projects, they're not just for fun. It's really important that all stakeholders at all times can actually make a business commercial appraisal of work.
It's really important because if you're putting a sound to your brand, you're saying something about yourself, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
So you have to deep dive into what the brand values are and that to convey that in a tune.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you're going to end up with ultimately creative assets that have absolutely nothing to do with your with the brand that you're trying to convey. So it really is about trying to capture that DNA and everything that brand stands for right up front and getting that strategy right. That will also look at all of the touch points that that brand has at its disposal as well. And what's really interesting when we go through this process with clients is that typically they find that there's many more touch points at their disposal than they first think. If we take an airline, for example, it isn't just the television adverts that you see in the radio ads or your kind of social media, whatever it might be. It was the entire consumer journey of the moment that you step on board that aircraft to, if you see them on TV or whatever it might be, your lounge experience, your journey from the moment that you even think about buying a ticket on the airline. What does that journey look like?
How many touch points do Norwegian have?
I mean, there were loads. When we delivered that project, there was something like over 100 assets that were delivered that scaled right from those tiny, if you like, we'll call them audio signatures, that appear, that are almost like the sign-off in an advertising context, right up to over half an hour boarding suite of music that wasn't just a loop, it was an entire piece of music that was designed to really drive home relaxation in that setting. That was juxtaposed, if you like, with, when you're as a low-cost carrier, which is what they are, they need to drive home messages of of low prices and sales, if you like. So when you're in a sales environment, that sound needs to be much more brash, much more in your face. But the boarding environment and the journey that you want to take passengers on there, it needs to be really relaxing. And that was actually born from the managing director of Norwegian was on a flight very late at night at JFK, and they'd gone on board the flight, and prior to doing this project they just played kind of pop commercial music, and it really angered them that they were on this flight, getting ready, if you like, for an overnight flight back into London, and it was basically blaring pop music, which was just really inappropriate.
When did they do the project? When did they?
It got released a couple of years ago now, and it's been in existence.
I was going to say,
because
I've flown on Norwegian on an overnight flight, and I can't say I noticed.
Right,
but
that might have been successful then.
Probably a good thing. Yeah.
I don't see, because I did my usual sort of like have something to eat, have a couple of drinks, get on the plane, go to sleep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wake up at Gatwick and I'm fine.
Yeah.
But then that's what they planned for you to do.
That's what I want.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Interesting. And then, probably leads me into then the measures of success for these. Do you hope that people will be humming these tunes?
I think it kind of depends on the context that you're in. I think there are definitely a lot of projects where the ambition for clients is that people remember those things and they're humming it under their breath. We've got quite a few projects on at the moment where one of the actual just initial, when work is presented, one of the measures of success, even that I live by when we're practicing work, is that I'll listen to it in the evening, and if I wake up the next day and I can hum it over my breakfast cup of coffee, then we're onto something. If you can't do that, often you're not quite in the right space. But that's for brands who really want to drive pieces of sound that become part of the sort of fabric of our lives, I suppose, things that we like. You were right, Liam, in saying that there are a number of things, and there's a number of examples out there. They're actually quite irritating, and they're designed to be irritating and kind of slap you around the face. And so, you probably, I'm just thinking aloud, if you look at like webuyanycar.com, who've now gone right down to the not the most, it's not the kind of thing I'm going to hum over my breakfast cup of coffee, but it's kind of a part of my psyche. I can sing that and everyone locks onto it very quickly and we know what we're talking about. Similarly, we did something the other day down the road actually at the Soho Hotel where we played, it might be interesting to kind of weave this into the podcast here. We played an audience the first opening 2 seconds of Billie Jean by Michael Jackson, the drum groove that the track starts with, and you can just play people like a tiny snippet of a drum groove with absolutely no context whatsoever, and the whole audience of maybe 350 people immediately said that's Billie Jean, and that's really interesting. And I think that's I suppose, if we're talking about measures of success, that is one of those things that anyone doing a project like this in the world of sound, that's the desire for anyone, that you're creating things that become part of our kind of, they ingrain themselves in our minds, and that's an amazing feat, I think, and one of music's great powers, that you can play people something that people might not have heard in a while, and it's instantly recalled by our brains, and that is one of the really impressive qualities about music, I suppose.
And then that saves you having to spend money on longer adverts, because if you play the tune, they already know what brand you're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah, of course. So effectiveness is obviously a massive thing in the world of brands and advertising across all parts of the consumer journey, and anything that drives those levels of recall and emotional preference are very, very, very powerful for marketers. They want to make sure that every pound they spend in those contexts is being utilised in the best ways possible. And I think for a long time, music's been it's always been the thing that people always kind of consider last in their branding processes. But what we've seen over the last 12 months and 24 months, I would say, is that really shoot to the top of the agendas of marketers across the world. People are taking this stuff really seriously at the moment, which is great.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's a couple of reasons for it. The first is that there's been some quite big brands this year release some pretty big identities. So the likes of MasterCard have released a Sonic identity this year. That's been quite big in the press. The idea is there that whenever you so much as tap your contactless card on a payment, the sound is present, and that there are many opportunities in the world now where sometimes we don't see a visual brand. We're turning our eyes away as consumers to visual media. We're bombarded with it day in, day out, and so brands are needing to find consumers in new ways, places that we always say, places that...
So now with MasterCard, when you touch, it plays a tune, does it?
There are environments that happens, not in all merchants, I don't believe, at the moment. That's their ambition.
Depending on the reader.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got,
exactly.
It will play a tune.
Exactly, yeah, you'll hear their sound in that environment.
So is part of that related to sort of like a growth in people thinking about an overall experience, that everything's not just about the transaction anymore, it's about how I feel and how that experience makes me feel? Is that part of that wider trend?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the big trend in brand land at the moment, I suppose, is the experience economy, is what it's called. Looking at actually how not only you can communicate a message, but how you can make people's lives better. And I believe in the MasterCard example that their ambition is to do up to 1 million tiny little activations this year. And as a brand, that's trying to put its message across, and that their ambition is that obviously there's a lot of moments within those activations that you might not be able to see MasterCard, but that's an opportunity for them to drive their sound home and to build equity in that way, which is quite powerful. So there's the experience economy side of things, but there's also the fact that we've got connected homes now, connected technologies. Things are moving into very voice-enabled environments as well, and it's not going to be long until people are booking tickets to Brighton, for example, and hey Alexa, can you get me on the 12:04 train from London Bridge down to Brighton, and your ticket will be booked. So brands have really got to think about what their identity is in those spaces as that becomes more and more prolific over the years to come.
Yeah, and you don't also deal with the end user, the end brand, if you're booking a voice-based ticket.
Exactly.
You don't see the website and everything else.
Exactly.
Which brings...
So, I was going to say, that brings us on to...
Well, I don't know.
I don't...
I was going to come to another question then, which hopefully is...
You go.
Well, we'll see. My experience working for Transport for London is that they value the estate, their advertising estate, based on how many eyes see it. Yep. So you know how many passengers are passing through, they know how many eyes are going to see it. Yep. Has that happened in the audio space? Has it been quantified how many ears hear it? And if so, are there more opportunities for ears than eyes?
Very good question, yes. So the conference I was talking about at the Soho Hotel the other day was awash with the sort of industry leaders who have been working very hard to quantify the data behind, the analytics behind how many listeners ultimately are on new platforms and new technologies, which was really interesting to me. That was even a bit of an eye-opener. That conference is called The Future of Audio, and it might be worth, if any of your listeners are interested in, it's not my complete area of expertise, the sort of data and analytics behind how these things are measured, but it was very insightful even for myself, looking at some of the industry leaders. Really it's a fight for how we can really quantify this world, and I was really impressed. Like, there's some really good technologies. The world of podcasting now is very, the analytics behind it is very, very, very strong. You've got all sorts of statistics about how, the amount of audio that your sort of average human being now is listening to on a daily basis is huge. It's kind of, people are, the world of podcasting is absolutely massive. People are listening to a huge amount of, I'm sure they will be right now, listening to a huge amount of audio day in, day out. And of course, as those worlds become more and more commercialised, all of in the same way as TfL, the advertisers are going to want to know, well, how valuable is this media estate based on the amount of people ultimately they're listening.
And on with regard to visual advertising, is you could have a whole big billboard and you can only have the brand identity sort of down in the corner, but you still pick it out amongst the noise. For sound, do you need to just be hearing the sonic signature, or can you hear it through lots of background noise?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we typically see is it's not just about that signature. That signature, if you like, is the distilled essence of everything that brand stands for in music and sound on a broader scale. And so what we say about sonic branding is very simply that it's just anywhere that you hear a brand. So the space that we're sitting in now has an acoustic about it, and if you like, this is a bit of this is the sonic brand of this space, I suppose. In some ways. And so what we encourage clients to think about is much broader than just a sign-off or just an asset, but actually what's the entire world of sound that you're looking at, be that from the environment that you're in through to actually how you can start tailoring that environment with sounds of your own, and also within those, if you like, the signatures and logos that you've mentioned there, the actual compositional, the musical DNA of those, being able to very subtly weave that into other environments as well, creates an entire musical landscape that's completely defined and completely bespoke to that brand. So I think there's big opportunity for people to think really holistically about sound, and it's all around us all the time. You can't escape it. You can shut your eyes and avoid an advert, can't you? But you can't. Yeah. Other than your Bose noise cancelling headphones, it's quite difficult to avoid.
No, but it's interesting, sort of like saying, because here we are, sat in a chapel, and it does have a sound, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I almost feel like we should be whispering because we're in here. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's certain. It forces us. The environments that we're in force us to behave in very different ways. So, and with that comes a certain aura as well, particularly with this space. So, they can be very powerful, the environments that we're in, I think, sonically.
I think, where I was going to go back to, because before I sort of like rudely interrupted and asked if George was playing, you were going to say that you're working with transport clients. I mean, we mentioned Norwegian. Who else have you worked with?
There's all sorts. I mean, we're doing a lot of stuff. There's a lot of conversations going on at the moment, which are all quite hush-hush about, particularly with cars. Electric vehicles are obviously massive.
Because they have to make a noise.
They have to make a noise.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of conversations going on with a lot of car brands around actually there's actual legislation in place, government legislation about, how's that vehicle going to sound. And so these are very early days in that world, but that's something certainly to keep an eye on. I mean, you guys, I've got a question kind of back to you guys as well, which is, in from your perspective, knowing what you do about the rail industry, I would imagine that sound's probably not been something that's been too heavily focused on before, or has it? I don't know.
Well, I've got two things on that, which asking that question back to, because I think in the UK and probably to a certain extent Europe, sounds are to do with safety.
Yeah.
So like door sounds, but it's all and
piercing
I thought
noises.
Piercing, and I thought that was really interesting when you were saying about the way it makes you feel and the experience, and it's there for safety, but actually what it does is it puts you on edge. And in the work that I did at HS2, we spoke a lot about pain points within customer journeys, and that was one of the reasons why I was interested in sort of like how many touch points were there in Norwegian, and the whole point about the different types of touch points that you have is that at different times you want people to feel differently, don't you?
Of course.
And when they're on their journey, you want them to feel relaxed. You don't want them to feel those peer points. Whereas sort of like those, although they're there for safety, they do make you feel on edge. And everything. It's very intense, I think, in the UK railway system. Everything's, it's don't go there, it's shouty, it's busy, it's noisy, it is, it's an offence to the art. And why I brought that up was because Japan have obviously done lots of work in this area, because on their metro system, they have a whole symphony of different sounds that tells you, so you can identify what line you're on just by the sound, and they also don't have on their doors. They have a nice melodic melody that the doors are closing. And I did a study tour to Japan a few years ago, and I asked them about this, because one of the reasons why I asked them was because on the end of their escalators, I hadn't realised this, but I thought birds were trapped in the ceiling.
Right.
And it was because they have birds tweet when you get to the end of an escalator, and it's recognised as you're coming to the end of the escalator.
Yeah.
So they thought a lot about sound to make people feel relaxed on their journey. And that's what, and because and when I asked them why they do it that way, I say because it's offensive to the Japanese ears.
Really, that's interesting.
Well, actually, it's offensive to everybody's ears. It's just that they really get, wanting to relax the passenger.
Yeah. Did it work for you?
It did, yes, because it just feels more pleasant. You don't feel, it doesn't put you on edge.
Yeah.
So I think I think it would be interesting to have different tunes for different lines, because not just from an experience point of view, but how could that benefit people who have visual impairments?
Absolutely, accessibility.
Absolutely. How could we use that? What would you recommend?
I think that's fascinating. There's just while it's on my mind, there's a really interesting thing that it was a bit of a brand stunt, but nonetheless, it's quite impressive. On the same subject, there was a collaboration that Heineken did on the New York subway a few years ago now. But of course, it's the classic thing of when you, if you like in our terms, you tap your card on the reader or your Oyster card on the reader, you get that quite abrasive sound that you were just describing there. They did this lovely thing where they worked with a sound designer, so that when that quite abrasive sound did happen, it was replaced with a kind of symphony of quite interesting sounds. And there was this musical collage that was created in collaboration with the sound designer within that environment, which turned what is quite an ugly and quite abrasive aesthetic into something that was really quite peaceful and calm and quite lovely, and I guess in itself a piece of almost like sonic art, if you like. There was something of the contemporary art about it, and I think that ties in quite nicely with what you were saying there just about Japan. But I think that is fundamentally big. If we're talking about our ambition is always to get clients to think holistically, what an example of holistic thinking to have gone into that much detail, the Japanese with their railway system, in that way, particularly as you say with the lines and the accessibility and it almost makes sense, doesn't it? It's like another it's another way of guiding people and humanity through what is a very complex thing.
Because each line has a colour, but it doesn't have a sound.
And I think that is a really interesting concept. I think you should approach TfL with it.
There you go. Well, this is the nucleus. This is the nucleus of the idea. But it totally makes sense. And if you even take TfL as an example, it is characterised. It's in its current state. It's a very sonically. It's quite abrasive, I think. I don't know whether you'd agree or not. But it's very sensory from a sound perspective, isn't it? Be it purposeful or otherwise.
And that's part of where I was saying about pain points on people's journey. Feeling overloaded with everything that's going on around you. Whether it be noise, whether it be visual or whatever. That all leads to you feeling anxious about your journey.
Absolutely.
And I think what's interesting about that as well is they did some research in the Netherlands as well, where they've done some things with music. That I don't know whether they've rolled it out, but they did a pilot in Rotterdam where they used different types of music at different types of day to reflect the behaviour of people using their stations. So in the morning when people were on their way to work, they played sort of like upbeat music because they wanted people to get through the station quickly. But in the evening when it wasn't so tense, they were like and people were more in a good mood because they were on their way home, and they played jazz music because people were sort of like chilling down, might be having a glass of wine or whatever on their way home to relax. And I think it's interesting how music can make you feel different.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, look, if we take it even the way that we drive when we're behind the wheel of our cars, if we're listening to a piece of heavy rock music, we're going to drive in a very, very different way to than if we're listening to a very lyrical piece of classical
when you go running, depending on what you're listening to.
It completely changes our behaviour. But I think that's fascinating. I think we also can't talk about this area without probably mentioning SNCF in France. Obviously, very iconic use of sound.
See if I can find that and play that in the background now.
I mean, it's one that we all, from the minute you step off, if you get the Eurostar across to Gare du Nord, you'll probably hear it within.
Can you impersonate
moments.
it for us?
I'm not going to try and sing it. That's one thing you won't get out of me. It's quite a difficult one to sing, I think. But
there is one on. I think it's Southern have one as well.
Do?
It's that when the announcements that a train is coming through, there's definitely a particular tune they play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, to mention as well, just on the subject when we were talking about the tubes, is we should also probably mention voice as well. You know, the amount of people that you hear impersonating Mind the Gap between the train and the platform. Tourists.
True.
You know, there's a real sense of Britishness, isn't there, within that? And furthermore, voice is such a powerful way of conveying character. And I think what TfL have done really well is to liberate a lot of their staff to be themselves when they're doing their station announcements and everything. That's a really nice, lovely embodiment of the brand, which is about the people that are behind it. And that's a very, in what could be a very kind of sterile corporate thing, that you get a very kind of straight delivery. It's lovely to see personality there, and I think that really brings the whole system to life.
And I assume that some of that is because when it's different every time, you are more likely to listen to the actual words than just the stayed announcement every single time.
Yeah, but I think I would imagine, and maybe you guys can tell me whether you know anything about this, but I would imagine that it's maybe a kind of a brand decision at some point to say, actually, we're perfectly happy for the drivers to be slightly comical or whatever it might be. We all know there's always those moments.
But I think that's part of a trend, isn't it? About
Absolutely,
sort of like following, that you have a brand and you must follow it.
Yeah.
And say everything to the letter, as opposed to being my authentic self at work, and the fact that we don't all have to, if we want pink hair, we can have pink hair. If we want to wear earrings or whatever, we can do. It's not, there's more flexibility. It's become more liberal, hasn't it?
And I think that's great. And voice is a part of what clients often, consider as part of their sonic identity, really. It's such a powerful conveyor. If we picked up the phone to one another, we'd both form an opinion on how we look and how we behave very, very quickly. And it's only until you meet someone that you start to shape that a little bit. So it's a very, very powerful conveyor as well of a brand.
Which is funny when that's what's taken out of all the online communication when you're messaging people.
Yeah.
Is that none of the message is conveyed, and also you completely misinterpret what someone is saying when it's just text.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, if I could just bring you back to
please,
one thing you mentioned about the behavioural change from sound, and then talking about stations and staff making announcements and things, are there opportunities that we're missing to nudge people to do things in a transport environment using sound that we just don't think about now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we discussed a few the other day, didn't we? Just sort of on the spot. I mean, the classic example, I suppose, of a starting point is the bus garages that play classical music to discourage antisocial behaviour. I believe that was a TfL initiative some time ago. But all sorts. I mean, we were talking the other day, weren't we, about particular environments along a station platform of where there's opportunity to play sound. Sound is inherently has a lot of humanity behind it a lot of the time. What I always talk to everyone about really is that what I find really interesting, my interest in music really, is that it's really the embodiment of it's made by people, it's created by people. There's a lot of humanity behind it. We were talking about ways to I suppose discourage people from, if anyone is thinking about jumping in front of the tracks or whatever it might be, so that there's an opportunity there within the station environment. But I mean, all sorts along the journey. We're so responsive to the sounds around us. Yeah. Another very good example, just on a humanity thing, is that a study was done where they took the sound off people's iPhone lock. So people were locking their phones, putting it in their pocket, and then what they do a couple of minutes later is just check. If they haven't heard that sound that it's locked, then they're checking their phones. Yeah. So and then we call those things more kind of ear cons, so like icons but ear cons, and those little nudges in life that tell us to do things and all those sorts of things can be really powerful. So it's not necessarily always about broad pieces of music or whatever it might be that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, but what are those little nudges along the journey as well?
Yeah, there was that. I remember the advertising campaign from Volkswagen about all the thousands of times trying to make the door close. The sound the car makes when the door closes, reassuring sound.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of.
Remember that?
Because we don't have one now, but we've had a Volkswagen, and I always slam the door, and my husband always says, "Door shut."
Do you feel satisfied with that?
Yeah.
You feel like you've got the right sound? They have got the sound right on that. Yeah. There are a lot of acousticians and kind of engineers, sort of sonic engineers that are within, particularly the more premium car brands get. They really care about how all of those little features sound, and it's a classic example that you've just shared there with Volkswagen.
Well, it works, I remember it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right.
But I think that is interesting. Just sort of like wrap you up based on that whole experience, isn't it? Is thinking about everything, how it all fits together, and just with you saying about feeling, because that's what music does more than anything else, isn't it? Even if it's just a little jingle, or something you hear in the background, it makes or even if it's just crowds or whatever, everything makes you feel something if you hear it, doesn't it? In a way that maybe if you see something it doesn't do.
Absolutely, yeah. They become part of the fabric of our lives, those things, don't they? Sort of subconsciously or not, sometimes very consciously, sometimes subconsciously. So, yeah.
Just thinking actually on that is we often having conversations about helping people with autism get through busy environments. Do you think that there is a way that you could have a sound that sort of comforts them through the overstimulation through an environment, so that there's a sound that's always there that blocks out everything else?
I think there's a study in that, probably. I'm no scientist or I'm no psychologist, but there's I would always just say it's
we'll do that with consultancy.
But no, I think that's a very interesting concept, and one that it'd be fascinating to find out, wouldn't it?
Right, action for us.
Yeah. Action for us.
Cool. Yeah.
Well, Max, thank you very much. That was
I've
fascinating.
got one last question.
Oh, okay.
Fire at me, yeah.
One last thing.
What's your favourite tune?
Oh, it's a difficult one. Well, I always give the example of my morning kind of ritual is I get up and the first thing I do is I plonk on LBC radio. I don't know whether you listen to it. So with Nick Ferrari at breakfast is my big thing. And so that is it's so repetitive in my working week that it becomes that sound of their sting, which might be one to drop in here, becomes quite a sort of kind of gets me in the zone for the day ahead. So it's a real it's a real kind of marker of, as soon as that radio is on, as soon as I hear Nick Ferrari's voice and I hear the sort of news sting, if you like, and the beds that sit around it, it really characterises, I guess, my kind of my working days, and gets me sort of ready for the day ahead.
Wow. See, I'm Radio 4.
You're Radio 4, okay, lovely, yeah.
See, so I start off with the morning briefing.
Right,
and
nice.
then I know when they finish the paper review, it's time to get up.
Yeah. Nice.
And I'm not answering that.
Nice.
All right. Thank you, Max.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, that's been really interesting.
Cheers, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to What Moves Us.